Not again.
Hello again. Again. Once again.
Hello and welcome to the Exploding Appendix podcast. Today we are talking to Keston Sutherland about Marx and the Poetics. This session was recorded on the 11th of April 2023 as part of the Avant-Garde Practice and Research Group's free weekly meetup, and you can join our meetups in Brighton or online on Zoom, and you can find us on SoundCloud, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook and Eventbrite. I apologise for the poor sound in the first 10 minutes. Now the interview.
So I just wanted to say a big thank you to Keston for joining us today. Actually, we didn't do an intro to you, but I don't know if you wanted to say that. So.
Okay, I'm Keston. Hello, glad to be here. Thanks everyone for coming to this. And I don't know, I'm a poet and I write about Marx a bit and about.
Yeah, I've been reading through your work, especially focusing on your work on Marx and Poetics. You're obviously a poet and you write about poetry as well. So alongside writing your own poetry, writing about poetry, and the relationship between Marx and Poetics has been a recurring theme in your work. So what originally drew you to this?
It's always really hard for me to pinpoint exactly how anything began for me. But I remember quite distinctly one day catapulting myself out of bed after having spent quite a long time working in a warehouse when my role was to package condoms into boxes. I sat and done this assiduously and found my imagination spiraling off and deliberately trying to fantasize kinds of future destinations, the liaisons that these commodities would end up in. And when I know one day had a terrible fever and just thought, fuck this, I really cannot do one more day's work right now, and just decided that I wouldn't. And then the next day, I got out of bed and threw myself on a computer and was wearing a dressing gown. But I felt like I wasn't really wearing a dressing gown. I think I felt like I was wearing a stapler or some blancmange or a pistol or something. I just felt completely compressed and trapped in my physical body, and sat and began writing about something that very compulsively, which, as far as I knew what I was doing at the time, which was really not very far at all, felt to me as though it was like a squeeze some horribly pressurized experience of wasted life out through a tight in my head somewhere and out into language. And that experience, though it didn't instantly bear on working with Marx. So I guess now that I think about your question, does feel like a kind of origin sorts. I should probably say, before I say the next part of my answer, that Marx, of course, writes about origins and what origins are in capital. And he's very wary of locating origins or specifying or identifying origins in history, partly because he argues that the identification of origins is often a trick used by bourgeois or capitalist political economists as a way of kind of constructing these innocent histories in which the massively unequal distribution of wealth has simply ended up the way that it did because of some original heroic act which allowed one person simply to rise above all the others, or one class. So Marx was always very chary about origins. I can say more about that later. But this sort of protracted, fragmented, splintered, slightly psychotic origin of my own history of engagement with these two things together definitely started partly as a physical sensation. Sensation is something that had to be squeezed out of me. Another experience, I think, was besides sort of never having any money and having to do work that I hated, which was definitely a fundamental thing. Another experience was the first time that I tried to read Capital by Marx, which I did first of all in English in the Moore and Ablin translation, which just happened to be the cheap copy that I picked up. So not the Penguin Folks copy, which is one that most people probably would have read today, but an earlier 19th century translation. I can say a bit about the later one in the life. But I tried to read this actually when I was in China, kind of partly hitching around the Chinese countryside and partly getting trains, other forms of crowded public transport. And I was on an overnight train and I sat and tried to read this book and just found myself completely kind of focused on the logic and the exposition of the logic by Marx, until suddenly I hit the notorious chapter on the fetish character of qualities, which anyone who's read the book tends. Early on in the book, it's probably been the most fertile sense of recycling Marx's political theory and other principles. And when I read that chapter, I thought, what on earth is he talking about? This is crazy. Suddenly the thing seemed to have flown off the rails. It seemed to me that he was no longer simply describing how capitalist societies work, or how commodities have value, or how things are exchanged. But the thing suddenly had been twisted, or had become this kind of grotesque parody of philosophy. And I didn't any longer really feel confident that I knew what it was that I was reading. Now, at that point, something like my first intimation, or my first sense of a poetics of Marx, I guess, began to gestate, or I began to flickeringly to suspect there was some kind of these texts, which were
Well, the previous was a surplus to the simple exposition of logic and categories for the thing that's good for me. Because it just really messed with my head. I didn't know what Marx was talking about. So I had to come back again and again to this chapter of Marx's work capital, and later on, subsequently, come back to the German text, reading the German to try to figure out what exactly was going on. Again, I think I might say some more about this later. But that was my first moment when reading Marx felt to me as though it was also, in some strange sense that I couldn't yet explain, a bit like reading poetry. Also, when I was an undergraduate, I became friends with some other poets who were either really interested in Marx and critical theory, or sometimes just one or the other. I guess more of them probably more interested in critical theory initially than in Marx. So that was Frankfurt School and subsequent adherents in that tradition. And then around about 2003, when my life was caving in, I felt really dreadful, kind of on the precipice of my own life, not sure how to go on. And that then coincided with it. As you will remember, the decision to invade Iraq, which for me was a completely life-altering moment. I guess my personal history, and I think it was too in the world history. It's a terrible, catastrophic moment in the world history. But I became very passionately involved in this. I'd previously already been involved with this. Fortunately, I haven't yet with the campaign against sanctions in Iraq. Stuff previous invasion. And so when it was decided, and it was clear that it had already been decided before the UK and America would invade Iraq, I just felt suddenly this just absolutely enormous pressure in my life, in my mind, to try to dedicate all of the energy that I had, both to understanding what's going on and to doing what I could with my own intellectual and imaginative and emotional energies to somehow fashion some kind of reactions in response to what's happening. So I began to write lots of poetry about the invasion of Iraq, which for me required going back to and studying in more detail the work of Karl Marx in particular, but also the work of Lenin. So just later developments of Marx's critique of political economy and capital itself, to try to understand modern imperialism, which I think that obviously nakedly was mentioned back in some modern imperialism. So my study, I guess, of Marx in particular, not always in conjunction with poetry, but often more or less tangled up with poetry, began more in earnest, more thoroughly at that point, I think around about 2003 during the invasion of Iraq, when it just seemed to be imperative to be able to understand the world that I should make a thorough study of Marx. After that, just to drag this out a little further, I began teaching, and since then I've tried to teach Marx. So it's really important to me as a teacher, as a pedagogue, to put Marx front and centre in the university, so far as I can do that. And we've been able to do that, fortunately, a number of times during my work so far as a teacher. So I've run a number of seminars both here in the States, which we thoroughly read the whole of Marx's Capital, week by week, chapter by chapter, in painstaking detail. And that's been a great privilege for me. That's been fortunate to be able to do that. That's allowed me to think as closely as possible, as carefully as possible, and as imaginatively as I can, both about content of Marxism, about potential poetics being both found and elaborated out of it, and also its connection with poetry, because I taught that from in an English section at the all the poets that I have known and loved during the past 20 or so, maybe 25 years that I've been writing poetry, nearly all of them, we should say, are, if not Marxists, at least people who would sort of know what that meant and who hang around with the Marxists. Some of them maybe don't like Marxism and be anarchists, whatever, but they're also on the far left, basically, more or less. So that too has been kind of cultural scene incubator. There's loads more stuff. Oh, and I used to have I wrote poems, keep a block of lard with a straight staple pressed into it.
So I'm sure that a lot of people here already have some idea about who Marx was. But I was wondering if you could say a little bit about who Marx is for you.
I just remember a friend, it makes me remember suddenly a friend of mine, when he was a student with us, suddenly got this great vertigo and trying to ask about Plato, because I thought how ridiculous it was that he personally might, even within the limited span of an essay, have a personal relation with Plato. But suddenly with Marx, it's kind of mind-boggling. I think that might have a relation. But maybe we all do. He's a number of different figures, I suppose. I don't personally accept or subscribe to one very influential account of Marx, which chops Marx up into the early and the late Marx. Again, we like to talk about that later. This was very influential. 20th century French structuralist account of Marx, that there was this young romantic and then there was this mature, wised up scientific state. However, I do think it's probably true that Marx is kind of segmentable. We can break him up, maybe like a kind of violent kid like me would do a transformer and suddenly put them back together again. So there's a younger bit, which I think starts before Marx really knew anything about when Marx was a poet. This is something that a lot of people don't know, but Marx did write poetry, he wrote quite a few books of poetry. None of those books were published during Marx's lifetime for a number of reasons, probably the most compelling of which is they were shit. But also, he didn't try to get them published. He was only 18 when he was writing these things. He was a student at the time, and the source of Marx's poetry was the time-honoured and I think probably venerable one of sexual frustration, because he was separated from the woman he was in love with by all sorts of things. Culturally separated from her, he had to part, he was together until they were married. Separated by class because she was wealthier than he was, and also separated geographically. So he began writing all these love poems to her, and also poems to his father. Bizarre combination of sort of sublimated erotic love odes to this beginning best father, and at the same time these poems expressing kind of filial gratitude to this patriarchal figure in his life. Is a bizarre sort of heady combination for a poet, and he wrote really under the influence of the German poet Henry Mayers and other German poets around about that time. Marx, however, forswore poetry in a grandiose gesture in a letter to his father, when he said that he realized that he would never be able to soar fully to the great Olympian heights of poesy, and that instead he discovered that his duty was to become a philosopher, as he thought at this point, and that he had quickly read all of Hegel. And a number of people in the room, I think, mentioned doing philosophy work. I think you'll know that must be bullshit. Quickly read all of Hegel. However, he thought that he did. He said that he did. And he certainly read a lot of it anyway. And that apparently turned him off poetry good and proper, because he didn't really write poetry himself, though he did love poetry for the rest of his life and could quote from it in 5 or 6 different languages right throughout his life. Great tracts of Greek poetry and Shakespeare he could quote. So it remained really important to him. And even later in life, when he was a socialist or communist journalist, he kept an eye on what poets were doing and solicited and commissioned poets to write poems for
journals that he was editing or was involved with, it always seemed to him really important that the Working Men's International, the communist group that he ran, that he inspired, should have poets among it, that poetry should be part of the propaganda of communism always. So partly for me then, Marx is a kind of poetical and literary character. Marx also, I think, is just the most ferocious intellect that I have encountered. And by ferocious, I guess I mean that he is just unstintingly combative, absolutely unyieldingly confrontational and fierce in his pursuit of truth in argumentation. And for me, that's always been really, really intoxicating and impressive. So there are other philosophers who might, engage more than he does in the subtleties of kind of logical formulations or arguments. But for Marx, there is something just absolutely sort of brilliantly incisive about Marx's analyses, not only of the underlying logical structures of capitalism, which is what we read about, among other things, in Capital, but also of all of the passing events of his own time. So Marx, again, this is something that perhaps not everybody knows, but Marx wrote thousands of pages of journalism and commentary on everything that was happening in his own time. He was the most fastidious observer of current affairs and of politics. So, it's true, of course, and again, we could talk about this later, that politics is a foul spectacle, and it's enough to drive you insane trying to pay attention to it. And that was true for Marx too. But Marx was not someone who found politics so repellent that he thought that he could just switch off and ignore it, or that it was so itself was such a despicable phenomenon that it deserved only to be ignored. Marx watched politics with an eagle eye as closely as he possibly could, and wrote thousands of pages of articles, hundreds of articles about everything that happened. And many of these articles are so far-sighted, so virtually prophetic in the way that they can anticipate what's going to unfold in the logic of historical events that he saw happening around him. So I think that Marx, secondly, as an observer of current affairs, of politics specifically, was really unrivaled, not only in his own time, but I think ever since. I can't think of anyone else. So that in itself is just enormously moving and impressive to me. But perhaps, again, I could go on and on, but let me just say one more thing about him, which is that Marx also is, for me, probably the most challenging thinker that I know. And this is related to being such a fierce logician. So the second part of my answer, but it's not quite the same thing. Maybe I should attempt a distinction. He's the most challenging because he makes your life harder to live, right? He doesn't only present you with propositions that are hard to think, he makes it harder to live your life because it's, I'm wary of reverting to sort of shock-worn metaphors like he opens your eyes or he wakes you up, but perhaps those are fine, perhaps those will do. He really does both of those things, and he makes, I think, perhaps to pick a different one, he makes your body feel different. He does that to me. He makes me feel, as I walk around in a capitalist society, and as I see all around me, and as we all do see all the time, whether we are looking for it or not, we see in front of us the manifest evidence, the truth, the reality of hideous exploitation and the evacuations of people's existences under the domination of capital all of the time. He makes you see that so much more clearly. It's painful. It's like suddenly seeing the world in an extra dimension. And for me, that's a kind of pedagogy which is lifelong. So it's not that you suddenly get to the end of capital, you've completed it, and there it is, you've kind of switched on your headlamps. It continues. It becomes more painful. Sometimes it becomes almost intolerable. You find yourself, inadvertently backing away from or I do. But I think his pedagogy is a pedagogy of the senses, a pedagogy of the body, and a pedagogy of the mind.
So in your book,
and a pedagogy of the emotions.
Radical Anatomy
It's really a thoroughgoing, transformative experience.
Possibly,
I think,
in a
to
special,
read Marx.
the greatest
All of those
satirist
things.
of our
And that's
time.
not yet saying anything
How
about
should we understand
revolution
Marx,
or communism,
the
which of course
satirist?
Okay, yeah. So just first of all to say a little bit more about what I meant by that sentence and in that. So this is a book that came out a little over 10 years ago now, which I've never read. So I'll have to reconstruct my argument. I say I've never read it. I mean, since it's come out, I've never read it. Yeah, my argument there, which I think probably I can sort of honestly say was a reasonably controversial one, not everybody did accept it then or would accept it now, was that there is in Capital, in Das Kapital, Marx's great work, that there is a satire that's threaded in, if you like, that is involved with the exposition of the logic of capital. So when Marx is explaining how it is that, for example, we all of us, anyone who has to work in order to survive, is still partly a slave, something which for many people, of course, seems transparently false. You know, how could we claim that we're slaves? We're not actually in shackles, being compelled to work. He would say that, well, the process of our emergence out of slavery was never finished, it's incomplete. So we are indirectly still partly dominating in a form of slavery, he would say. So when he's explaining things like this, or when he's explaining even, to stick to something perhaps more unlikely and more abstract, something like the circulation of value forms in capitalist exchange, Marx is always arguing excruciating kind of way. He never simply is explaining the world to you in the way that other political economists or so-called political economists did. To cite only the most famous ones, Adam Smith with The Wealth of Nations, who explained long before Marx a labour theory of value, explained that by working we create the value of things. Or David Ricardo, the English political economist after Smith, an enormously influential figure on Marx and on the whole economic thinking of the time. When these other political economists had explained how value works, how production works, how sale and purchase and consumption works, they were doing a number of things. First of all, they believed more or less, whether they said so explicitly or not, that they were explaining truths which were more or less kind of transhistorical. They were more or less eternal. This is just simply how things do work. You can't make a profit unless something is worth more than something else, etc. But these are just almost akin to eternal laws of nature. And secondly, they were doing it in a language which was carefully and thoughtfully composed in order to communicate effectively with a literate but non-specialist audience. So they were doing it in a way designed to be sort of helpful and to explain things as far as possible without having to use mathematics or anything else. And this, of course, they didn't own up to, this third thing, but Marx all the time stresses this truth. They were also doing it in what Marx describes as a form of sycophancy to capital. In other words, other political economists, and I think this is true of most economists today too, were in effect in the pay of capital, whether they were directly in the pay of capital or not. And many of them, of course, were directly in the pay of capitalists. Now, when Marx takes over these categories, like the category of labour or the category of the commodity, and when Marx begins to put these categories into a logical order and to argue and to explain, on the surface, he's doing something very, at points at least, quite similar to what these other political economists had already done. And yet the subtitle to his book, Capital, is A Critique of Political Economy. So in what sense then is his use of the same categories that political economists have used, a critique of political economy? It's not just a critique of capitalism, notice, but capital is a critique of political economy, which is the way that capitalism has been defended and explained, and its necessity has been expounded and argued. Now, Marx, in a way, does explain the natural necessity, as he calls it, of the development of capitalism too. But he describes the natural necessity, the inevitability of the development of a system of production in which we are all eating each other, in which we are all emptying ourselves, in which we are all being sucked hollow every moment of our lives, in which we are all, in effect, cannibals, in which the ways in which we exchange things is not merely different from a gift, but is a grotesque, hideous parody of a gift. Now, partly this is a satire against the kinds of complacent uses of political economic logic, which you will find in Ricardo and in Adam Smith. In other words, it's designed to express the contemptibleness of the ways in which intellectuals found good arguments for their exploitation of the poor. So in that sense, it's a traditional kind of satire. But in a more complicated sense, I think Marx believed that the existence that we actually are living right now, the bodies that we actually are in, the feelings that we are bound up with, that these existences are in themselves actually substantially almost satirical kinds of existences, in that they are so dissevered from the ways in which human beings could and ought to be able to live with each other if they were actually to be able to flourish and to realize their potential. So in other words, we're trapped in these existences where we're eating each other, hollowing ourselves out, and these existences are like the kinds of gross, hyperbolized, exaggerated existences that you would find in traditional satire. So people may know Jonathan Swift's really famous satire called A Modest Proposal. If you don't, Jonathan Swift, who famously wrote Gulliver's Travels, he wrote this satire, and in which he says, a modest proposal for decreasing the poverty in Ireland, and this is in the 18th century. And he says, and he has a very long-winded introduction, which is written in the beautiful sort of house style of a kind of British parliamentarian. And it turns out that his modest proposal is that we should eat Irish babies, that this would decrease population in Ireland and it would cure the hunger crisis and everything else. And clearly this is, is intended as a satire by Jonathan Swift. Now for Marx, that's, Marx admired that kind of satire. He admired Swift, he admired Diderot, he admired other satirists. But for Marx, it wasn't simply that we could use a hyperbolic or grotesque or exaggerated description of reality like that, a fantasy, as leverage against reality, the way that Swift was using a fantasy of cannibalism as leverage against British Parliament, but that the reality that we actually live is in effect really the kind of thing that Swift was describing as like an exaggerated and satirized existence. The thing that the life we're actually living now is a satirical existence for Marx. So how then do we measure that against some other kind of model reality or some reality which has not been exaggerated, which has not been hyperbolized, objectivity as it is? Well, this is where it gets really complicated because for Marx, there is no such thing as an objectivity against which we can measure this grotesquely satirized existence which we really are living, because the only thing we have is value objectivity. I think we might talk about that a bit later. It gets quite complicated at this point, but I'll do my best. However, two simple points there, which are, well, not very simple, I admit. I'll try to distill them. The first is Marx is a brilliant lacerating satirist in traditional guise. In other words, he points out the contemptibleness by allowing it to expose itself in all of its grotesquerie and all of its idiocy, in the way that satirists have done ever since Horace and Juvenal and Alexander Pope and everybody else. But in this more complicated sense, he twists up the logic of his own categories to produce a vision of reality which is both indisputably accurate and true and insufferably unreal or fantastical. How can it be true that we live an existence where, in effect, we are eating each other all the time? That surely can only be a kind of fantasy. And yet, Marx logically demonstrates that this is in fact reality. So that gap has been cannibalized, that gap has been devoured by capitalism. We're living a kind of grotesquely satirized existence. There's lots more to say about that, and of course I could only fully illustrate this point if I had passages to kind of pass around and throw in.
You spoke about Marx as a critic of origins, and also about this distinction between the early and later Marx. And one of the critiques of the earlier Marx is that perhaps he holds as important and celebrates a kind of origin, this notion of species being or life, as a kind of origin that, in humanity in its origin is living this immediate existence in touch with their reality and with each other, and then capital alienates that existence. And what communism is the claiming back of that original state or something. So I just wonder how I'm not saying I think that is necessarily a criticism, but I wondered how you negotiate that kind of critique of a kind of romantic Marxism.
I don't know how much everybody in the room might know about this. I guess there is no everybody in the room. People will have different sort of familiarities with this debate and with the early material by Marx. Just to fill out a little bit this distinction between early and late. This distinction, the kind of chief architect of this distinction was a French philosopher called Louis Althusser. And Louis Althusser, again, I don't know how much anyone knows about him, but for a period at least, he was an enormously influential philosopher, not only in France, but in the UK too. And there were these feverish debates within the UK left and amongst sort of communists in the left, among them notably E.P. Thompson, about the validity or otherwise of Althusser's interpretation of Marx. And one of the most controversial features of Althusser's interpretation of Marx, which was extremely emphatic and assertive in Althusser's presentation of it, was that there had been what he described, and I'll explain this term, as an epistemological turn in Marx's thought. And what he meant by an epistemological turn was that the younger Marx This is the sort of the question. I'll get round to the question directly in just a second. But it was about this end of Marx. The younger Marx was essentially still in thrall to two thinkers in particular. One was Hegel, and the other, and perhaps even more malign influence, maybe for Althusser, was Ludwig Feuerbach, a German philosopher who Marx knew a little, was just slightly older than Marx, who I think was actually a really interesting figure, Feuerbach, and deserves defending. Anyhow, Feuerbach in particular had developed what came to be, first of all, known as and embraced as, and then later on kind of ridiculed as, a so-called kind of philosophy of love. And Feuerbach's philosophy of love did indeed say that there was some kind of capacity within human beings and for a form of sort of self-realization through intimacy with each other, a self-realization through being together, and a self-realization through recognizing the full capacities and the full potential of what it meant to be human and alive, which was enormously impressive to Marx. For a while, Marx was kind of delirious and intoxicated by the influence of Feuerbach, and wrote to Feuerbach and said that Feuerbach's philosophy was, for him, worth the whole of the rest of German philosophy put together, and the whole of the rest of German literature put together, he even said about one of these texts. So for a while, Marx did, I suppose we could call it romantic, but I'll come back to that word. Marx did embrace this philosophy, which, it's of course much more complicated than I'm able to say in a few words right now. But the key thing about it was that it did, I don't know if glorify is the right word, but it certainly passionately celebrated the necessity of love and of intimate love. And secondly, of course, the most, perhaps even more controversial and more important part of Feuerbach's work was that Feuerbach was an atheist, was a very determined atheist. He wrote a book called The Essence of Christianity, which incidentally was first translated into English by the novelist George Eliot. And The Essence of Christianity is an extremely powerful account of how it is that Christians have mistaken their own, the best things about themselves, essentially, the best things about what it means to be a human being, and this is going to sound like psychoanalysis, but that's not accidental, because in a way, Feuerbach did anticipate psychoanalysis, that they have projectively identified all of the best things about being alive as a human being with an abstraction, which they call God. And that what needs to be done instead is to recognize that all of these wonderful things that Christians have praised in God, about his all-knowingness, his powerfulness, his mercy, his love, etc., really are simply kind of abstract reflections of the things which we could achieve in our own lives were we not hampered by, and any number of things here, were we not hampered by. So there was a kind of philosophy of the potential for the realization of humanity through intimacy and through love. As I say, Marx was enormously impressed by this and influenced by it for a period, for a couple of years, probably. And then later he did, it's true, turn away from Feuerbach and indeed from Hegel and decide resolutely that he would set about trying to study instead the ways that economies created wealth. And that's obviously quite a big leap, it seems, quite a big leap. Now, the question, to come back to this distinction of Althusser's, is it in fact a break, as Althusser says it was, to go from being passionately interested in what human beings might be able to achieve, were they able to realize their potential through intimacy and through coming together, to go from that to the arguments that we find in Das Kapital, the Logic of Capital, about exploitation, domination, the emptying of life through labor, value forms, all of these things. So Althusser said, yes, it is absolutely a break, and the early Marx is dangerous because the early Marx is liable to sort of divert the working class into this sort of sentimental dead end of this fantasy of imagining that all of our problems could be solved simply, all you need is love, essentially. So it's our imperative then, as serious philosophers of revolution and indeed as revolutionaries, Althusser believed, that we should make sure that they understand that this early work exists under the sign of a kind of romantic infamy, that we can't take this early stuff seriously. Now, whether or not we agree with Althusser's diagnosis about what working class people can think and whether they can understand and think for themselves about things like intimacy and love, I think is an interesting question. I personally think that whatever we think about that, all of these themes from Marx's early engagement with Feuerbach can still be found in his later work. I think they can all still be found in Capital. So insofar as to your question directly, if Marx was originally a kind of romantic thinker of love and of intimacy, I think he remained that thinker. And I'm not sure I would call it romantic. I think that word has become so toxic, so problematic, has been so often misidentified that we may as well just set it aside for the moment. But I certainly think that he remains the thinker of intimacy, of togetherness, of community, of how it's possible to actualize human potentials through coming together right up to the end of his life. So I don't believe in the necessity of the epistemological break, to put it in kind of jargonistic terms, or more simply, I don't think that Marx had this massive change of heart, gave up thinking about intimacy, instead started thinking about value. I think instead that it seemed essential to him that if he was truly to understand what human potential was and how we could realize it, then he couldn't restrict himself merely to philosophizing about intimacy in the way that these other philosophers like Feuerbach had, but that he instead must dedicate the next 20 or 30 years to the most serious, sober, empirical study of the real history and current workings of capitalist production. And that's what he did. But you can still find those arguments about love and intimacy if you look for them right up to the end. And good, right? Because ultimately, what do we want? Do we want a society in which exploitation and domination have been eliminated? It's good, yeah. So that, and I think there has to be there has to be a next point in which it's possible to imagine human flourishing. And there are some people who would say, okay, well, let's not worry about that until it happens. If we try to imagine it now, we're using the thought forms that exist under capitalism. I think that Marx never believed that. I think that Marx believed that we're alive, that he believed that we're alive once on Earth, and that each of us within our own lives has the potential to imagine a life that would be good for us, and that we could actually love to live, and that we'd be happy to live. And that he didn't have this kind of hard-nosed Christian Puritan type belief that if you were born before the revolution, then you were doomed, just like the Christians believe that if you were born before the coming of Christ, then you were doomed, We can be born long before the revolution, but still understand what happiness means. And I think that Marx believed that throughout the writing of Capital, but he wasn't going to extend little sentimental olive branches to the philosophers who were still stuck in this more sort of sentimental traditional mode, thinking only about intimacy and using only abstractions to think about it. So it's a very long answer, but it's a short answer, actually.
Yeah. Keep in mind.
So I'd actually like you to expand on that a bit more, if that's okay, in a sort of way connected to your own poetry. So I've been reading Keston's poetry for a long time. I've probably read more of Keston's poetry than I have of Marx. But in a sense that something you're touching on, this description of happiness, of what is next, of the kind of intimacies you're talking about. I believe that your poetry has more and more reached towards those things. It's become more and more confessional. It's dealt more and more with kind of personal intimacies of loss, of love, of kind of personal pain. And I kind of want to ask for some examples of this in Marx, actually, some kind of concrete examples of I don't know. I mean, the critique is one thing, but for me personally, I've found it quite difficult to find in Marx's work.
Yeah.
The kind of descriptions of what communism, the kind of communism that I think you're talking about here, might actually look like. And I feel like in your poetry, you're maybe trying to ask that question, or at least push through it on these terms of kind of intimate address. And I wonder if you have any examples of things that Marx wrote specifically to address this question, really. Because I suppose his most famous work is a critique.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, thanks. The question, so much to say. Firstly, just about my own poetry perhaps becoming more confessional, more intimate. Okay. I think, okay, I'm not going to legislate for all poets, obviously, but my belief, anyhow, is, or this has seemed sort of unavoidably true for me as a poet, is that you have to write the poetry that the life you have gives you. So it's no use having a kind of program and deciding that you'll write to complete your program, or that you know what kind of poetry ought to exist in the world, and so you'll be the one who makes it exist. Poetry comes from somewhere that's not so easy to locate or to fix, and it has to, if otherwise it's not poetry, for me anyhow. So if my poetry has, and I think probably that's a fair description, if it's become more intimate, I'll come back to confessional, then it's because the life that I have been dealt or have been living has been one that has felt as though I'm going to have to figure out intimacy if I'm to survive. So I think poetry for me has always felt like survival. So right back to that sort of anecdote that I told at the start about, working in the warehouse and then springing out of bed filled with rage and writing a poem. Kind of survival. Poetry has felt to me always like something which, which keeps you alive, which keeps me alive when I write it. And I hope that if it could do anything for anybody else, then that might, it risks sounding grandiose or conceited, but I hope that it could maybe feel a bit like that for someone. Sometimes it can help them to keep themselves alive a bit. Anyhow, so intimacy definitely feels essential to me, because otherwise people begin to kind of wither or recoil into forms of psychic retreat, what might even feel like the sanctuaries of loneliness, but which can prove really pathological and damaging. And I think for a long time I felt unable to write poetry that was intimate except in the most extravagantly self-destructive and damaged mode. In other words, intimacy was something that had to be felt at the same time as you were kind of, trying to disentangle yourself from a massive ball of barbed wire. Or intimacy was something that you could speak only with a mouthful of glass that you've just been chewing for the past 10 years. So intimacy was something which was very hard to get to touch, to feel was real. But now I've started just to feel differently about that, I suppose, to feel as though there's a real pressure to speak much more directly. Where does Marx do this? It's okay. So Marx doesn't directly write about this. There are little comments by Marx about love, and some of those are the kinds of things that you might expect. So Marx writes kind of withering, kind of satirical comments on the sentimental philistinism of other philosophers who talk about love. So in those brief commentaries, he'll confine himself to the kind of satire A that I was talking about before, the more lacerating mode. However, when I said that the earlier Marx and the preoccupation with a kind of Feuerbachian philosophy of human flourishing could be tracked right up through Capital, this is a difficult claim, and it would take some time to defend it. But if I were to look for something like tenderness, something like intimacy in Marx, I would not look for it directly there, because certainly there's absolutely nothing explicit in Capital about intimacy. But what he does describe by a kind of twisted, almost unthinkable kind of logical echolocation, where he's throwing ideas against horrible objects and feeling them flung back into the logic of argument, is he describes the kind of outer limits of a really crushed and abjected form of human crushed closeness, which is the opposite of intimacy. In other words, he describes the situations in which people who are being horribly exploited as labour forces are crushed into tiny living spaces with not enough air to breathe. We saw loads of this recently in the construction of the stadium for the World Cup. Loads of it in China, of course, rampant all over the world. Massive proletarianisation still underway, of course, right now. So bodies that are crushed into closeness but can't achieve closeness because they're merely being crushed together both physically and spatially, and also ultimately by the logic of capital itself, which binds them into what he describes as knots of humanity. Or he describes the emptying out, the Menschenverwüstung. He describes the laying waste, the desolation of human nature through the repetitiveness of what he describes as hateful acts of work torture. So if you do a job, which everyone here has done, which you hate doing because it feels to you so obviously the opposite of what you ought to be doing with your life somehow, you can't explain how that is or why that is, because, you know, what does that mean, the opposite of your life? It immediately sounds as though it's metaphysical or religious. You know, what is your life then? If that's the opposite, if the opposite of your life is pulling pipes, then what is your life? And yet it feels true. It feels true. Like, I'm emptying myself. I'm not just emptying this bucket, whatever I'm doing for my work. I'm emptying myself. So Marx does describe very graphically this kind of brutal logic in which human lives are emptied, crushed, mangled, mutilated. Now, of course, that sounds like a very unpromising example of a comment on love and intimacy, but I think it really is. I think that's what it is. Of course, very indirectly, but you won't find any of that stuff in any of the other political economists. You're not going to find that stuff in Adam Smith or Ricardo. Why is it there? Okay, so is it there only to illustrate social history? It certainly does illustrate social history. It certainly does sort of pull back the curtain on the horrors of the factory system. He does that for sure. Social history is really important to Marx, no question. But also it makes you feel, as you read the text, quite how horrific this all is. The sense of vertigo becomes ever more acute. The sense of being sort of surrounded by an unlivable, unbreathable kind of air becomes ever stronger. I'm sure not for everybody, but I think it's supposed to. And I think this is, when we get around to the question of the poetics of capital, this is the poetics of capital. It makes life feel unlivable, but it doesn't make life feel unlivable by tricking you or by sort of making you hallucinate. It makes life feel unlivable because it is. It just reveals to you, in fact, how unlivable the life that you're living really is, and how different life therefore implicitly must be possible. Because how could we, all of us, spend all of our life on earth living unlivable lives? And that's just simply how things are meant to be. So whether or not we want to then reach for theology, then reach for metaphysics, then reach for whatever, a vision of communism, something is wrong. Let's just start there. Life feels wrong. It feels wrong to do a repetitive activity 8 hours a day for 40 years and know that you're going to die at the end of it, and that's that, right? It's obviously wrong. There's something essentially wrong there. And Marx never shied away from the absolutes. He never shied away. He was, of course, a relativistic thinker, but for Marx, the relative and the absolute are not just alternatives. It's not just one or the other, right? Social relations involve moments of absolute horror. So the two go together. So there's something absolutely horrific about the domination of life by capital, about the capital relation itself. In the acknowledgement of its absolute horror, there is implicit some kind of seed of vision. Now, Marx refused to spell out exactly what that was. You're quite right, Verity. Marx notoriously didn't say what communism would be like. He notoriously just didn't explain what it would be. Now, we can explain that if we want to in all sorts of different ways. We can explain it by going back to his famous letter from the 1830s to Arnold Ruger, where he says, our business is not to come up with the blueprint of the future. We are simply the ruthless critics of everything in existence, which sounds like an amazing gang. And I want to be in it, right? We are. And he was. We are the ruthless critics of everything in existence. So originally that was a point of principle for him, a point of theoretical and philosophical and political principle. But he wasn't someone who stuck with principles like that by simply putting in his intellectual heels. Marx changed his mind all the time throughout his life. But interestingly, he didn't change his mind about not giving this blueprint. So why did he not? If you thoroughly read Capital, then you'll find only towards the very end of the book, on about 3 pages, a couple of flickering little intimations of what a communist society would be like. And they are so disappointing. They really are very disappointing. He says that some of the labour that we currently do, because we're paid to, and we have to be paid to live, we'll still be doing under communism, but it will count as something else. And that's the word he actually uses, count as. Like, hang on a minute, that doesn't sound like communism. That sounds like what, I'm going to fight on the barricades so that I could still be doing my job, but it just counts as something else. But for him, this little glimmer, there's a real transformation at this tipping point when it's no longer a relation of exploitation, it's no longer a relation of domination, it's no longer an emptying, because you might be performing the same physical act, but you're doing it for not just for different reasons in your own mind, but really substantially, materially, for altogether different set of consequences, and in an altogether different system of social relations, right? Within a communist system of social relations. So the glimpses of communism are few and far between in Marx, partly out of principle, partly out of wariness, I think, and partly perhaps that he didn't know. Let's not pretend that he was omnipotent. He just didn't know, maybe also, and did want to see what would happen too. But it's just to complete the answer, to come back to my own poetry, for me, it is going to involve some kind of realization of currently blocked or stifled being together, whether that's called intimacy or love or whatever. At the end of it, there's going to be a bit more of that.
So we might also see Marx as an important influence on avant-garde poetry and prose. So whether we're talking about art manifestos or the futurist poetry of Mayakovsky or Alexander Gastev, we can readily see kind of rhetorical traces of Marx. So in what respect is Marx's writings key to the development of avant-garde poetics?
It's hard to say. I think it's easier to be a Marxist than it is to read Marx. I think you can emotionally, sentimentally, culturally sort of be, yeah, okay, I'm a Marxist, that's fine. And I think I was like that for a long time before I made a thorough study of Capital or anything. So I think there are plenty enough poets who probably are Marxists in that sense, who, wouldn't necessarily be able to quote chapter and verse of Capital, and that's fine, great. But as far as Marx's own writings and their direct effect on the development of avant-garde poetry, oh God, I'm in danger of another long answer here. Okay, first of all, the problem. The term avant-garde is problematic for me. Obviously, as we all know, it's kind of military metaphor. So it's the first wave, the attacks. It's the Wagner group. So I don't really believe in an avant-garde anymore. I don't think of myself as an avant-garde. I don't believe in that I belong to one or anything. I tried to talk about this a little in a lecture which is online. Where I talk about wanting to be in the middle rather than at the edge or in the front. However, I understand that historically, of course, this has been an important word. There were poets. Hugh MacDiarmid, the Scottish poet, and one of his poets, was really influenced by Marx, and his poetry is filled with the language of Marx. Louis Zukowski in the United States, George Oppen, Mayakovsky was influenced by Marx. There were poets who were influenced by Marx. Do we love their poetry because they were influenced by Marx? Personally, not really. I mean, that makes me more interested to have a look at it. But I don't know. I think the answer to that is probably not enough. Marx hasn't influenced poetry enough. I think it should influence poetry more. I want to see, Simon Armitage's, elegy for Prince Charles tomorrow, with the kind of exposition of the circulation of value forms. I think that would be great.
You write that Capital is both critique and poetics at once, and that the power of the poetics is the power of the critique, deadlocked in a tangle of inseparable but irresolvable logics. Why is understanding the poetics of Marx important?
First of all, what is the poetics of Marx? Why is it important to understand it? Okay, maybe that would be the rational way to answer the question, but let me try instead the perhaps more counterintuitive but exciting reverse way. So why understand it before I even say what it is? Understand it because it makes life harder, as I said, and because okay, first of all, I think it's the right and true way to understand what Marx meant, to be simple. So I think that if we try to read Marx and only to understand either A, what was wrong with previous political economists, and or B, what's bad about capitalism and capital and social domination, then of course that's crucial, but we'll get only so far. I think we also need to understand how a passionate intervention in the world, an intellectual, literary, active, wholehearted intervention of the kind that capital was, is more than simply another explanation of how bad things are and how things are wrong. There have, of course, been thinkers who have produced more refined or subtle accounts of certain kinds of social injustice than Marx did or could have. No, he's not a god. So Marx got a lot of things, I think, really importantly right, and more maybe than anybody else. He was a great thinker. But what did he do that other good or great thinkers who were critics of capital and capitalism could not do and did not do? And of course, there were actually loads. At the time, Marx was by no means alone in writing about the horrors of capitalism. There were lots of English writers at the time who were talking about how terrible it is, how horrifying it is, how appalling it is, that workers existing, the average age of a worker in the UK was like 28, average lifespan of workers something like 28. This is horrifying, right? And then there were others who wrote about that, not only either as sentimental Philistines, not only as kind of philanthropists who were writing from the ivory tower and sort of tut-tutting about the behaviour of capitalists. There were people on the ground who were writing about it, but Marx did something that none of them did. So first of all, if we try to identify what that is, besides the much more penetrating and powerful character of his actual critique, which is doubtless outstrips all the others by miles. It's also that, as I've tried to sort of sketch out already, he put to work the categories, the logic of the critique of capitalism, the logic of capitalist value creation itself, in ways which just really vividly bring to life just how unlivable life is, which make not just explicit, but which make painful and unlivable how bad things really are in life. And this, I think, to be fully sensitized to this, to how Marx is doing this, I think requires treating the writing that Marx does as more than simple illustration or figuration. So when he talks about lives being sucked hollow, for example, just to take one example, which he does all the time, he says, when you go to work, you are sucked hollow. So imagine like literally someone with a giant hoover ramming it in your skull, right? That's going to work. So, lots of people have noticed this and they say, yeah, but that's figuration. What he's doing there is just using a kind of metaphor to describe how bad it is. Okay. And what that does then, if you say, okay, well, that's a metaphor. If that's poetics, if it's a poetical metaphor, then it's just, it's a kind of shop window. It's just how he sells his thing by making the ideas kind of grisly or attractive or exciting or whatever. Now, see, I think that poetics goes deeper into the logic of the critique than that. It's not just a shop window for the ideas. He's not just dressing them up in gruesome imagery or figuration. It's the truth. So poetry tries to tell the truth. How do you get to the truth of the actual sensation of really wasting your entire life doing something that's hateful to you? And not only something that's hateful to you, but something which doesn't allow you to produce comfort for the people that you love. Something which doesn't allow you to do all the things that you know you could do. And something which every day endlessly reproduces you in your own poverty and in your own subjection to these hateful forms of power. And something which every day, all of the time, reproduces these gigantic concentrations of wealth in the hands of these monsters who live over the top of us, right? These absolutely obscene characters, these billionaires. And, sometimes people say, well, it was the kind of violent difference, the polarization of society was so much more extreme in Marx's day. You've got the sort of Dickensian paupers, etc., and then you've got the sort of top-hatted bourgeoisie. Completely nonsense. It's much more extreme now, right? There's massive globalized proletariat now. You've got these millions of people across the world living in slavery. Then you've got kind of caricatures of humanity like Elon Musk. I mean, the difference there is absolutely vaster than it ever was before. So I'm talking about now. How do we understand the grotesqueness of society now? And when I was just sort of enumerating or listing all of these sort of hateful facts about what it means to be a wage labourer, what it means to be alive, Marx hammers these into you, into your flesh, into your body, into your sensations, into your senses. You walk around in the world feeling different, looking with different eyes, hearing things differently, seeing the way that people adjust themselves bodily to these hateful existences, seeing the ways that people sort of find themselves automating their own bodily expressions because it's kind of company policy that you be polite. Finding all of these ways in which all of the spontaneity of expression gets gradually extinguished and you end up being this thing that you look back on with horror, thinking, what is it that I've become simply in order to be able to survive at subsistence level? Marx isn't using these images of being sucked empty and hollowed out, etc., just to illustrate the underlying logic. The underlying logic in itself is, of course, crucially important, but it's no more important than how it makes us feel when we think about it. And this is where we come back to something like the necessity of the Feuerbachian inheritance, because how we feel about these things is just as important as the fact that they're actually happening, because we are, after all, thinking and feeling creatures. That's what human beings are. So fully to appreciate the Poetics is both to read Capital better, more alertly, to understand what he really means, and how he's different from all other economists, and it is to live the kind of life, or to stand a better chance of being able to live the kind of life which Marx wanted or hoped that people would live, which is a life which is more painfully sensitized to the hatefulness of capital, the horror of capital, because that's the best kind of physical and emotional preparation for a potential development into a kind of revolution.
So I see often employ metaphors with relative levels of kind of chemical violence, what was it, chewing on grass, things like this.
Yeah.
And it seems to me you're talking about this almost necessity when Marx talks about the violence which capitalism does on something which runs everyone.
Yeah.
Exploitation, all this sort of thing. And you have to talk about how nasty it is and how bad it feels. Right? I remember seeing this infographic going around a while ago that was talking about how to strip violence from the use of language. Instead of talking about killing two birds with one stone, talk about solving two problems at once instead of talking about a deadline, talk about just a finished date or something. Because of the sort of supposed psychological effects of using kind of violent metaphors and euphemisms, it would be better if sometimes this to talk about things in a way. Which, to what extent you sceptical of what some people might call sort of liberal ploy to make it harder for people to talk about the sort of conditions under which they suffer in these kind of visceral ways.
Yeah.
And to what extent might you agree with someone like, I don't know, Zizek maybe, where he talks about actually vulgarity and profanity being extremely important tools for people on the left?
Yeah, I hadn't actually consciously intended to use violent metaphors like that, but I'm really glad that you pull me up on that, because I think this is important. Okay, first of all, violence for Marx means lots of different things. There is, of course, the violence of, one person hitting another person, physical violence. There is the violence then, which is that violence, plus the complexity of state power. So the police hitting someone, or the military, shooting people dead. Then there is an underlying structural violence, and lots of people know about this, of course. The violence, which is the intrinsic coercion of the domination of labour, the form of which is wage labour itself. So even the wage form is a form of violence for Marx. Getting a wage is a form of violence, because you might be very happy to be given it, but actually what the wage form is, says Marx, is it conceals that you are being robbed and that you are a slave. That's what the wage form is. So when you're given that, it's like being kicked. It's a form of violence. Now you might say, okay, well, I'd rather have my wages than be kicked. But would you rather be kicked or have to work doing something you hate for your entire life? There's a form of structural violence, which is absolutely core and essential to capitalism itself, which all the time is being prettified and disguised. And Marx is really good about this. So the wage form in particular is, he thinks, the fundamental way in which in capitalist societies violence is disguised. And I'll come to a point about language. So if we can prettify things in language by saying, rather than kill two birds with one stone, then, I don't know, massage one hedgehog with a baguette, then, everybody can sort of see on the surface why that might be simply a civility. And of course, here we come close to another argument, which is a different argument about potentially harmful use of language in other ways, which I think is also important and needs to be kept separate. So I do believe in us being thoughtful about language in other ways, but certainly to describe the effects, the horrors of exploitation, of being trapped. I think that there is no limit to the violence of language. There's no legitimate limit to the violence of language. I take a step further, and I don't know about Zizek, but there was a thinker, I don't know if anyone has read Georges Sorel, at the end of the 19th century. He wrote a theory of violence, specifically. And it's a very dangerous theory, I think, even right now. When I read it, I'm really very uncertain. It makes me feel very uneasy. But he argues in this that the illusion of parliamentary democracy, which is a bourgeois illusion because it always concentrates all power, economic and political, in the hands of capitalists, and always will. The illusion of the democratic character of bourgeois democracy depends upon a kind of fundamental belief, which is that in a democracy, everything is acceptable except violence. That when we're violent, we've overstepped the line. That we can all have a civil debate, but if it starts getting violent, then that's unacceptable, right? And of course, we see this platitude repeated all of the time in the House of Commons. As soon as anyone oversteps that line, that's the line that can't be overstepped. And Sorel says, so any serious revolutionary proletarian movement has to first of all laugh this to scorn and understand that violence is a weapon of the proletariat. So if you're going to seriously oppose bourgeois political power, you cannot afford to be moralistic and squeamish about violence. So as I say, I'm not sure how I feel about that, because obviously that could go in lots of different directions. That argument has been made. It's a very powerful and potent, maybe intoxicating argument. Insofar as it applies to language, I believe in violent poetry. I do. Poetry that I love best is really violent. And when I say it's violent, I don't mean it is violent in a way that we can all just kind of laugh about. I mean, it's upsetting. It is actually upsetting, even to people who agree with it. So I'm actually not really much interested in writing or hearing the kind of poetry that everybody in the room will sort of chuckle along and say, yeah, that's what I think. And that goes for an audience of committed, die-hard leftists or whatever. I believe in a kind of poetry which is itself kind of violent in its expression, which creates tensions in a room. I think tensions are productive. Tensions indicate trapped potentials. So I believe that, poetry ought to do this. So, I don't know about, Zizek, I just feel really, I find Zizek all obnoxious in all sorts of ways and unlikable in others. I struggle to kind of affirm anything that I hear attributed to him. But I certainly believe that the left shouldn't flinch from being violent in its language. For sure. But then this is very complicated when it comes to politics, and this shows what a charade politics is. Remember, Marx said politics is just a game. Politics is just a committee for the representation of the interests of capitalists. That's all it is. It's a stage show. It's theatre. So currently, this attack ad on Sunak, right, plainly does have racist undertones, plainly is trying to sort of stir up hateful feelings among what it imagines, Labour HQ imagines will be the kind of bigoted old Labour voters, etc. Should we all be up in arms worrying about this kind of political stage show, stagey rhetorical violence or not? Marx would just stand back and laugh, say, leave them to it. right? Okay, where's our counter-violence? Our counter-violence should be much more extreme. Now, how are we going to describe the people who write those ads in Labour HQ? Let's counter their violence with one that's like hilarious, right? One that's, much more explosive. That said, I teach at a university. I don't believe in disrespecting people in the room. I believe in using language in ways that's thoughtful and that takes account of genuine and legitimate sensitivities about the histories of rhetoric and the histories of abuses of language. So it's a kind of dialectical thing. It goes both ways. But I definitely love violent poetry. And music, violent films.
An essay entitled The Poetics of Capital, published in 2019, you discuss Henry Hyndman's bungled translation of extracts from Marx's Capital. You write that Marx assaults his readers with the image of beloved limbs ripped apart and darling heads crushed flat. Hyndman softens the mental lighting so that these same beloved bodies instead more agreeably just fade away, ephemeral as an enchanted fairy in a forest dim by Keats. The workers who in Marx are crushed, sucked out, laid waste, decertified, elasticated, tortured, and distorted into human specks, stumps, and fractions, are by Hyndman regenerated in a language of literary respectability as lyric poet, who now rejoice in the gleam of a transient prosperity, only to be cast into deeper despair on the next stagnation. So what do translators get wrong when they ignore the Poetics of Capital?
Marx's Capital was published first in German in 1867. It took a while for it to appear in English, and it appeared initially in fragments. It appeared first in some fragments which were translations of bits of chapters of Capital, a kind of little anthology, I guess, of greatest hits from different chapters by a man called Hyndman under the title England for All, which now sounds absolutely horrifying, doesn't it? England for All. But at the time, that was intended as a revolutionary slogan. So it was supposed to, and it sounded like that at the time. It was supposed to mean England not just for the rich, but England for the poor. So Hyndman was someone who knew Marx a bit and used to pop around sometimes to see the Marxes. That was his first mistake. Marx was very intolerant of tedious people and didn't like to be disturbed by house guests whose company he found unedifying. And Hyndman was an example of this, not only because he was a bit stupid for Marx, and Marx was an extremely bullying, I think it's probably fair to say, intellectual. He did not enjoy the company of people that he thought were stupid. And Hyndman's second mistake was that he went to Eton. So he was a rich public schoolboy, and he was a convert to the cause of socialism, like George Orwell did, went to Eton. So this again didn't sit very well with Marx. And Marx appreciated it when people understood properly the logic of what he had argued, doubtless. But he also had more kind of intuitive suspicions about people's readiness really to be on the side of the revolution. So it wasn't enough just to get it, just to understand the argument. You also had to be passionately committed. And there were some people in Marx's acquaintance who he believed really were passionately committed. And he said as much in his letters to Friedrich Engels, who was his closest friend and comrade, of course. Marx and Engels together wrote the Communist Manifesto. And so a few of these people, Marx said, this guy's really solid. He knows it, but he believes it, which is just as important. Hyndman, I think, believed himself that he knew it, but didn't really know it, and he probably didn't really believe it. So Marx was quite suspicious of him. So that in itself already set up Hyndman to fail, effectively. However, he made another really big mistake, besides being who he was, which was that he didn't attribute his translation to Marx. He just presented it as his own work. So for Marx, this was completely outrageous. Marx, it would have been to anybody, but Marx in particular was extremely jealous of his own achievement, I think it's fair to say. If you look at the things that Marx wrote in 1867-68, in the year following the publication of Das Kapital in Germany, then there are reams of pages where Marx has copied out things that other people have said in column A, and then put next to it passages from his own book in column B, to show that they copied him, that they plagiarized him without acknowledgement. And this was happening all the time. And particularly it was happening among socialist politicians, serious socialist activists in Germany, who just took his ideas and reproduced them. And you might think, well, okay, hang on a sec. what's wrong with that? Surely, as a communist, Marx ought to believe in the common intellectual property of these ideas and ought to hope that they would be circulated as freely and widely as possible. Maybe that's true, and maybe here we touched on a tender point of Marx's ego or psyche, perhaps. However, for Marx, it was critically important that people get it right, and he couldn't bear it when he was plagiarized and people got it slightly wrong. Now, there are, I think, two ways in which people got it slightly wrong. One was that they would make category mistakes or logical errors in the interpretation of capital. So they would misdescribe the relationship between a wage labourer and an employer, say. That, of course, was insufferable to Marx because he was very serious about his critique. This critique was a weapon. He always said, I think someone earlier asked me about the word critique. He's always making critiques. For him, critique is a weapon. That's what it always meant, that word. So if you blunt the edge of the weapon by getting it wrong, by misunderstanding, even subtle little differences of understanding could be fatal, Marx believed. His word was the word. Now, of course, it does potentially turn him into, a kind of cult figure, which he didn't want to be either. He was just intransigent in every direction. However, this was one way in which you could get it wrong. But the second way in which you could get it wrong, I think, which was equally important, is that you could soften the language. You could turn it into something which sounded like everyday tedious journalism, or you could sentimentalize it. You could even get the argument right. You could understand properly the logical dynamics of how it is that people are dominated and exploited. But then you could make Hyndman's mistake, which is the one that Bradley just read out, where part of what Bradley read out was a quotation from Hyndman, the transient gleam of a vanishing prosperity, etc. That was Hyndman's translation of Marx. Now, Hyndman pitched his English up into a kind of respectable literary prose because he wanted intelligent English people or readers of English to admire his translation, right? He wanted people to think that he had written something which was good English, which was good literature in itself. But his concept or his instincts about what constitutes good literary English were entirely different from Marx's ideas. And the person who actually pointed this out first of all was, again, Engels. Engels often was sort of used as a kind of, he did some of the dirty work for Marx. He was kind of a heavy intellectually. So Marx would do all of the sort of hard intellectual labor. He was like the evil genius. And then he would send out Engels to fight the battles in the press. Engels would write all these reviews trashing the works of Marx's enemies. And Engels wrote this fantastic article called How Not to Translate Marx. And it was a complete takedown of Hyndman's translation. And he made two particular criticisms. He said anyone who's going to translate Marx has to be a great writer, first of all. So that sets the bar almost infinitely high right from the start. So who's going to do it? You've got to be a passionate, committed communist revolutionary and a great writer. Otherwise, don't bother. And secondly, anyone who's going to translate Marx has to think like a German philosopher in a specific sense. And this is technical but crucial. Whenever Marx uses a certain word and uses it repeatedly so that it begins to accumulate conceptual power. In other words, it begins to become not just a word in capital, but a concept that he is using. Obvious example would be something like value. Everybody knows that's a concept in capital. But there are others which are less obvious, like, say, pressure or emptying, words which Marx uses a lot. Whenever Marx uses these words, says Engels, his English translator must always use the same word. However, because otherwise the conceptual profile of the word vanishes. So English readers won't know that Marx used the same word again and again and again because it has been paraphrased, it's been translated differently each time in English. And this is what Hyndman did. So Hyndman started translating the words. And of course, this is partly just a problem that any translator will face, so that there won't always be an elegant or good sounding way to reproduce a sentence in one language in your target language. So what Hyndman did, and what every subsequent translator of Marx also has done, including Moore and Aveling in the 19th century and Ben Fawkes in the 1970s, was they sacrificed a bit of conceptual consistency in order to make it more readable and intelligible to an English audience. Because if they had stuck resolutely to the principle of conceptual consistency and translated Marx's word the same every time, then it would have sounded too clunky, they thought, or it would have been difficult for an English reader. So in other words, there is again a kind of assumption about what readers are likely to find intelligible or what they will be able to grasp, which I find problematic, just as I find Alceste problematic. Anyhow, this means that a lot of the poetics of Marx's original German have been deleted. And okay, before we get to the problem of poetics, a lot of the concepts of Marx's capital have been deleted, right? They're just not there in the English because the English translators have consistently found rough equivalents for the same word, which will be translated in 3 or 4 different ways throughout the text. So I think Bradley might ask me some about some particular examples of this, and I'll be able to illustrate it better then. But this is, so Hyndman made loads of big mistakes, some of which were just personal, and others were about just misunderstanding the necessity, translating with the mind of a philosopher. But it's more than that, it's the Poetics too. Hyndman softened it all. He made it sound as though the situation of the worker was to be lamented. Right, we were all supposed to feel very sorry for the worker because the worker saw his dreams snatched out of his hand. Whereas what Marx describes is a juggernaut of capital crushing the worker in its gear, like by his neck being ripped. Marx describes gruesome, vicious acts of vivid, violent destruction of human bodies. Hyndman skipped that and described dreams disappearing. So you see, that's a completely different atmosphere intellectually, a completely different kind of emotional atmosphere, even if the underlying logical critique is the same. But then my point is, well, the underlying critique of logic is not the same in those two cases, in fact. And this is where we see that there is a poetics of capital, because the way that Marx puts it, with all the violence packed in, means that the logic is a different logic, because it has a different effect in the world, and it describes a different world.
In Stupefaction, you discussed the way gelate tends to get translated as frozen. How does this translation distort Marx's original meaning?
I'm sorry to be pedantic about this thing. I have to correct the pronunciation. The word is Gelehrter. Gelehrter was Marx's original German word. And in the English translations, it gets translated generally as congealed. Sometimes it's frozen. But this is a really important example of how it gets paraphrased. So sometimes it's congelations, sometimes it's congealed quantities of labour, sometimes it's frozen. Marx always used Gelehrter, the same word. Now, this is how I really started first writing about the Poetics of Capital, is when I just by chance sort of discovered this. So I was reading the English version. I thought, well, what word is Marx using here? Because congealed, as you may know, means frozen, right? So the Latin root of that, congelation, like this is why we have gelato as ice cream, right? Because it shares etymologically the root with freezing, like ice. So the idea then, in the English text, all the English texts of Capital, the entire Anglophone reception of Capital, ever since Capital was first published, has been that the labour that we do, which ends up in the form of a commodity like this, is congealed in the commodity. In other words, we can see our life staring back at us as this thing. My life was given to make these objects, etc. And the specific process Marx described was the process of congelation. It was frozen. Now, the problem with that is, A, Marx never said that and didn't believe it, and I'll come back to that. But B, why didn't he believe that? Why would he never have believed that exactly? Because the process of congelation is reversible, right? So if you freeze something, if I freeze my life in the form of this, then presumably, if that metaphor is to be coherent, then I can unfreeze it again. So how do I turn that back into my life? How do I turn all of the stupid objects that I was forced to build in my life, doing, wage labour or whatever, how do I turn all of those back into time? Marx's point is that, of course, you cannot. I've frozen on there. I don't know whether that means anything, but there we go. I've actually congealed. It's an amazing conceptual art trick that I've been planning, and it works. It's great. You can't do that, right? You can't reverse the loss of your life back, because Marx believed that the loss is more grievous than that. He believed that the loss of time in wage labour is the extinction of your humanity. It's not just a bit chipped off that you can stick back on. It's not just getting cold and then warming up again when you go home. It's the extinction of your humanity. You are sucked empty by it, right? You are turned into a husk by doing something that is hateful repetitively for your whole life, right? You're turned into a caricature of humanity. So what Marx didn't then say congealed, what did he actually say? He said Gelehrter. He said the commodity is a Gelehrter of human labour. So what is Gelehrter? So when I read this, I thought, shit, that's something totally different. That doesn't mean that at all. And Gelehrter is gelatin that is used in pork pies, it's also used in nail varnish, interestingly. So it's used in the production of cosmetics. Even then, did Marx know what Gelehrter was? Absolutely. How do we know this? Well, if we look up, and again, no one seemed to have noticed this, but the popular circulating definitions of Gelehrter then in the German language were an encyclopedia called the Mayers Lexicon. Would Marx have read Mayers Lexicon? Yes, for sure. How do we know? Because he was paid to write for it himself. So Marx was actually writing Mayers Lexicon there. Gelehrter, a horrible tremulous substance. Now, how is Gelehrter made? It's made by grinding up the hoofs, teeth, and horns of animals into a mass that is absolutely irreversibly melded into one blob, a tremulous blob. It's this kind of disgusting shit which is made out of the offcuts of animals that the rich would never eat, right? The rich don't sit around eating ground hoof. Or maybe they do, actually. I've never, in their parties, maybe, snorting antlers. But anyway, Gelehrter is this. So when you work, you end up in the form of Gelehrter, says Marx. Now that clearly is quite a poetic idea. That isn't just the logic of capital, right? It's not merely a logical argument to say this. And he says this again and again and again and again throughout capital. You are Galette. You end up in this form, which is essentially there to be consumed. It's a comestible. It's a disgusting commodity. It's a commodity made of the offcuts. It's this thing which is irreversible back into the body parts that it came from. And similarly, your entire body is transformed by the experience of labor and being exhausted and exploited. Your hands become different hands, your body becomes a different body, your head becomes a different head. All your bits end up getting chopped off and melded into this one blob-like thing called abstract labor, which is the value of what it costs to buy you. Right, so this is what Marx is arguing. Galetta, that's a profoundly poetic critique of capital. You've never found anything like that in David Ricardo. So that's the first thing that I noticed. And then I started scouring the rest of the German text up.
Because obviously there are issues with translations around Marx, and not really capturing the spirit of what he's trying to say, which I think what you're arguing. But is there something which, I guess, kind of transcends the translators and something which the English language can't really capture from the original German? And I'm just like taking from examples that I already know, which is like things like in Hegel, like Existenz, Dasein, and Begriff. They don't translate well to English. They don't really capture the spirit of what was originally being said. So is that something which English translators can actually overcome, or is it just a restraint of the English language?
I mean, okay, so Marx disliked intensely, and you can fill in virtually anything in the rest of that sentence, but Marx disliked intensely the ways that philosophers cultivated special philosophical vocabularies. And so, I mean, obviously, Heidegger's after Marx, but, the way that Heidegger, for example, argues that you've got to start again from scratch with language and come up with your entirely different meaning for a word which everybody uses every single day. Marx would have found that completely contemptible, because that's the sort of argument which is so aloof from the realities of, real communication with. He certainly didn't believe that. And in fact, he very early on became very suspicious of Hegel's use of specialist sort of definitions of categories. And he had this one kind of eureka moment where he just felt really nauseous. And he just said, fuck all of Hegel's categories, all of these words that he's using, all of these abstractions. Let's just take a step back. They're all just categories. What are we going to do with all these categories? And this, I think, was a really important moment for him. He had this love-hate relationship with Hegel. He got closer to Hegel again. But to come directly to the question, Marx, of course, wrote in English as well as in German. He wrote in French. He thought it was essential. The word sounds wrong, but to be cosmopolitan, essentially. In other words, to understand the cultures, the languages, the social relations of, the workers of the entire world. He really did want the workers of the world to unite, right? Later in life, he began seriously studying Russian culture and the Russian language. Marx read Greek. So all of these languages were really important for him. He certainly wanted his thought to travel. He didn't believe, in the way that Heidegger did, in some sort of fetishistic way, that there was something sort of magically specific and unique about the German language that couldn't be translated. Absolutely not. In fact, he spent his entire life attacking the Germans, right? So right from the start, his book, The German Ideology, is about the nonsense of German culture, the fatuous character of German thought in general. So he, just like Henry Mayers, the poet, never stopped attacking Germanness. He was the opposite of a nationalist or patriot. He despised it, and he hated any form of socialism in his own country which was patriotic. So he didn't have a patriotic attachment to Germany, for sure. However, that doesn't fully answer the question. Are there just insuperable problems? There are loads of problems. It's not just a different language culture, it's a historical problem too. Currently, you may all be interested to know, and some of you may know, there is a new translation of Capital that's being made by two people in the States. I'm actually corresponding with them about this right now and trying to make suggestions and offer some thoughts about certain particular passages and how things might work. And it's really hard to advance much further than the Faulk's translation of 1970s, which I've been rude about because I think it's important. But also, you've got to acknowledge it's, I couldn't have done it. It's really, really good, serious labour, 1,000 pages of translation of a very complicated, erudite literary 19th century German. Good achievement. But there are real problems. I think we just have to keep examining every single proposition, all of the uses, looking further and further. There may not ever be a perfect translation, but I don't think that it's insuperable in the way that Hegel, say, even, or certainly Heidegger or other German philosophers might even pronounce this insuperable problem of their own untranslatability. Marx wanted to be translated, for sure. And he wanted to be translated into English. He just thought that there wasn't anyone good enough yet. There's more to say about that. Yeah, there are no concepts in Marx that can't be translated, I think.
In terms of these problems of translation, I'm in agreement that these are important. I guess that I suppose it's a problem that comes up when you're talking about a revolutionary theory.
Yeah.
And a revolutionary theory that then did spread throughout the world. Within that, Marx talks about the sort of economic hegemonies all of the time. There's an educational hegemony as well. Considering the urgency with which capitalism, for example, and the Communist Manifesto as well, that urgency also carries something into the world, like an urgency for
Yeah.
revolution, for violent revolution, and that violent revolution then happens in many places. Most of the places where those revolutionary principles take hold maybe didn't have the privilege of the hegemony of education and the possibility of good translation.
Yeah.
And that then leads in lots of cases. I mean, I'm thinking an example would be like Cambodia, just you said something earlier about the outcomes of the labour change, but the labour doesn't change itself. But I guess I want to ask, what within that, like the Galata, the offcuts, and the human disposability becomes completely horrific, right? Like a quarter of a nation gets wiped out in 2 years under what is called a kind of Marxian system. And I'm sure like most of us listening to you would say, well, yeah, that wasn't a Marxist system. Did Marx sort of predict this? Did Marx think about this? Did Marx think about this kind of hegemony of education? Surely I guess there's a contradiction that comes up here, which is like that kind of education is a privileged corner. These ideas went into the world, and most of the people didn't have the privilege to even begin to translate these things in the proper way, even with the best intentions. So I don't know, did Marx predict this kind of, where do we stand now, like when we kind of use these terms and when we use these arguments? For some people in the world right now, that'd be completely horrific.
So when Marx finally completed Volume 1 of Capital 1867, and he'd been writing it for, depending on when you think he began, you could say he'd been writing it basically all his life, but he'd certainly been writing it for at least 15, 20 years when he actually knew what he was worth. And he, as he said in a letter to his friend, he said he had sacrificed everything to this. His life with his family, his prosperity. He'd been arrested at times, kicked out of various countries, had to live in poverty in London, couldn't go back to his country. He'd sacrificed his health, had terrible, terrible health, just used to go to the library every day trying to write his books. Then presented it to his friend, Engels, and then got back from Engels a letter which I think must have tested even Marx's self-belief. And there probably was no one more full of self-belief than Marx, maybe. Engels just said, I'm kind of disappointed with this. I just think this isn't what I'd expected at all, actually, from all those years. This is what you've been writing. And the problem is, this just doesn't tell uneducated working people what to do. Like, this doesn't spell it out. You should have organised it like a textbook, he said. He said you should have put it in bullet points, basically. You should have just said, this is what it means, this is how they're fucking you over, this is what we do now, this is... And Marx was like, yeah, I mean, he wasn't going to respond too angrily to this. He appreciated honest criticism, but he believed fully in what he was doing and his way of doing it. And he believed that the complexity of his argument was simply the truth that needed to be communicated. Now, there's an argument to be had here about this. Could it have been presented in a simpler way? In a way that took account of the undoubted reality that most people are not going to sit around having philological squabbles about the difference between Galata and congelation. Marx, however, thought that what he needed to do, not just for his own immediate moment, but for all time, potentially, was to put into the world the truth, right? The truth as he saw it. And not just the truth in a form which was kind of boiled down for consumption, but the truth which was not boiled down, which was not been galatified, if you like, the truth, total complexity. Now that might mean that he then relied on subsequent generations of explicators to make clear the force of his argument in simpler terms. And I think he did depend on such people, and he wanted such explication to happen with his text. But he thought it was essential to get the fundamental truth correct, first of all. And in his mind, at least, that required a very, very complicated form of argument. Now, there are dangers also the other way, aren't there, in saying that, most people don't have education, therefore they won't understand this. I've always, both as a poet and as a critic, resisted the criticism, which has often been put to me, that the kind of thinking that I'm doing about Marx is something that working people just have no interest in because they haven't got enough time or they didn't go to university or whatever. I'm from a working class background. For me, I went to a school that was extremely poor, a state school. For me, there was always something sort of appallingly disrespectful, and of course I'm not saying this about you, Verity, of course, but about the idea that people who don't have an education in the way that it's currently defined within bourgeois culture need to be essentially kind of condescended to and taken care of intellectually by simplifications. Marx didn't believe that either. And one of the reasons why he didn't believe that was to go back to what I was saying earlier about bodily sensation. He believed that people have an education through the senses too. People have an education through the experience of being crushed. There's no better education of becoming a Marxist than feeling you could barely survive because you feel that you're going to kill yourself because you hate work. That's fundamental to what Marx is arguing about. More important than anything that I say as a philologist about German translations or whatever is that basic fundamental sensation. So I think there is a Marxist pedagogy that is possible, that can happen, that can be made to come alive, that can be given a language to flourish, which is founded on what people actually just simply feel by being exploited. That's really fundamental. As far as this question about Pol Pot, lots of good ideas have been put into the service of bad actions throughout life by individuals, by groups, by any number of different people. So yeah, I can't possibly try to address right now the horrors of Cambodia and the Khmer Rouge, but it bears, as far as I can see, absolutely no resemblance at all to anything that Marx ever thought. Marx believed passionately in freedom of communication, in looking after each other. Marx made comparisons all the time between capital and war. He said working in a factory is a bit like being a soldier, because if you get shot or killed, no one gives a shit, and they chuck you in the bin. And that was absolutely true then about factory labour. As far as human life not being worth much in a regime like the Khmer Rouge, Marx wanted human life to be worth absolutely everything. And here we come back to Feuerbach, right? There was no disposable human life. Disposability and human life are the two absolute opposite poles of Marxist philosophy. On one end, you've got human life. At the other end, you've got the disposable. And that's what we are turned into by being made into wage labourers for Marx. Disposable quantities of abstract labour power. That's exactly what he calls us, disposable. So the idea that Marxist thought could be used to justify mass murder is just completely grotesque. Obviously it has been, and this is where it matters that you read Marx correctly.
I was thinking about your poetry again when you said, because something that always strikes me about your poetry, especially when you're performing it, is that it does something very physical, has a real tangible physical effect that you feel in the body. And is that something that you do on purpose? Or is it sort of happy accident?
I'm not as good at talking about my poetry. I don't find it as easy to talk about as talking about Marx. No, not on purpose. I'm much more self-persecuting as soon as I hear myself talk about poetry. I just think I sound like a prick immediately. But I don't do anything on purpose as a poet, really. Except maybe, not initially at least. So the poem starts, and I'll come back to it and try to push it in a certain direction afterwards, once I know what it's doing. But initially, at least, I don't want to have designs on anybody's experience as a poet. I don't want to make them feel a certain thing. I hate that kind of thing. Yeah.
But I mean, so you were saying earlier about writing something that makes a tension or creates a kind of conflict. Something physical about that.
Right. I like it when that happens, but I couldn't write with that purpose in mind, because if I did, it wouldn't have. I would just be. I think there are loads of poets who think they've got a trick that they can do, or who think that they're proficient in producing a certain kind of effect in a room, and personally, my experience of that is being kind of condescended to. So I don't want to know what's going to be the effect. And my experience of doing poetry readings, happy to hear you say that that's been your experience of hearing them. My experience of doing them has been finding out what the poem means by reading them. So I don't know what's going to happen. Recently I was reading a launch for Keats book. I read a poem which, to me, I feared that it was so absolutely irredeemably bleak that it was just going to be a real downer for the entire night. But then people burst out laughing. I was like, oh, thank God. It's funny. It surprises you. It surprises me anyway, giving a reading. Yeah, I don't have designs, but I'm pleased if that happens.
In Stupefaction, you write that no one, that is to say, has yet interpreted the concept of fetishism in capital as a détournement. In what way is the concept of fetishism used by Marx a détournement?
So I won't assume that everybody knows what a détournement is. So this is a word which was given a conceptual meaning by a French philosopher, I guess, or French kind of punk called Guy Debord, who wrote very famously a book called Society of the Spectacle, which became the kind of text that everybody held in their hands in May 68 in the Parisian student worker revolution, or attempted revolution then. So Guy Debord was a real kind of darling, sort of poster boy for the revolution after 68 for quite a long time. Very influential. And Guy Debord's argument about détournement was, and it just means turning around, was that he said, okay, we're in a fight to the death with capital. And he was interested in culture. So he's not now necessarily talking about the workplace, but he's talking about culture. What can we do with how capital just destroys, banalizes, empties, ruins all of the cultural experiences that we have, how shit everything is, how being alive is like just watching TV. That's a gross simplification. For the sake of just getting to the point. So he says, well, what we have to do is, it's not enough to be Marcel Duchamp, right? It's not enough just to vandalize things. So you may know that Marcel Duchamp, the famous French artist of the early 20th century, the one who put the urinal in the gallery in, there you go, that's art. He famously painted a moustache on the Mona Lisa, not the real Mona Lisa, sadly. And he presents this, said, here you go, there's my, and this was clearly a kind of fuck you to the art world. Guy Debord said, good, that's a step forward, but that's not enough, because that vandalism is not enough now, because we've got advertising now, and that vandalizes everything anyway. So we've got to do something more extreme than that. What we need to do is turn around capital's own productions and turn them into poisons and weapons against capital itself. So it's not enough just to mess it up or like run into the art gallery and take a shit and run out again laughing. We've got to somehow do something that's really going to actually turn their things against them. So he did lots of kind of guerrilla actions where they would go and just, ruin people's lives in various ways. One of them, the Situationists, his group was called the Situationists, one of them actually got killed doing one of their stunts where he ran in during the Easter ceremony in Notre Dame in Paris, dressed up as a monk, started screaming and chucking things at people, and they got killed by the police. But they tried to really sabotage the kind of the culture of capitalism. Détournement was his theoretical term. Turn it around, turn it against. How is fetishism in capital then a détournement? So bear with me. The fetish character of the commodities is this chapter in Capital that I mentioned right at the beginning, where everything starts to become more complicated. Marx describes how commodities have this fetish character. So when we see this, we compulsorily fetishize it. Now this has been misread in a sort of clumsy ways by people who think that he means that commodity fetishism just means that you really love commodities. Of course, it never meant that. It's not like sexual fetishism. But it means something much more complicated, I think, than ever was explained. Now, it is a détournement of a concept that Marx took from the work of an 18th century French aristocratic ethnologist called Charles de Brosse. And Charles de Brosse was a government functionary in pre-revolutionary 18th century aristocratic France. And he wrote this racist ethnographic text about Africa, in which he said that we can see that humankind follows an arc upward of natural development from darkness to the light. So at the bottom, you have Africa and the African, and they are like children. And they compulsorily fetishize things. They fetishize their wooden idols and the animals. They pray to the snakes, etc. They pray to the sky. They're like children who fear things because they have childish anxieties. And then you have the Asians, etc. And it goes all the way up to the Europeans. So it's this kind of racist fantasy about the development of humankind. And this was called The Worship of Fetish Gods, this book by Charles de Brosse. Now, Marx read this. He thought this was hilarious. And in the description of the Africans compulsorily fetishizing lumps of wood, he thought, this is the contemporary French Parisian bourgeoisie. They compulsorily fetishize wealth and commodities and everything that they produce, surplus value, their exploitation of others in exactly the same way. They don't know that they're doing it, they can't stop doing it, but they are doing it all of the time. And this is the condition that we live in which we believe that these objects around us simply have to exist. They have to be exchanged. They really are worth what we say that they're worth, value in his and them, etc. All these arguments. So he took this idea out of Charles de Brosse's racist ethnographic text, turned it around against capital themselves, and described the most sophisticated philosophers, political economists, and Parisian intellects of the day as fetish worshippers of the commodity form. So that's what he did. He turned it around against capital itself.
So in the Poetics of Capital, you write that Marx's neologism, Wert gegen Stagnlichkeit, literally value objectivity, is paraphrased by Ben Folks in the standard Penguin edition, first as the objectivity of commodities as value, and then as objective character as value, and then as objectivity as a value, and then as objectivity of the products of labour as values. What's the problem with doing this, and why should we pay attention to the poetics of words like value objectivity?
Okay, so that's just a good example, one example of what I was trying to describe before about the necessity to keep conceptually consistent. In other words, this is a word which in Marx is used again and again and again, Wertgegenständlichkeit or Wertgegenständlich in the adjectival form. And this means literally value objective. He used it as one word again and again and again. Now, English doesn't really permit, to come back to the question about languages, the construction of compound nouns with the same kind of facility that German does. So here is a problem, at least, a difference between English and German. We don't really make up words like value objectivity. And we can hyphenate them, but they sound a bit kind of clunky. Whereas in German, it's natural, they do it all the time. You don't need to hyphenate it. It was paraphrased in loads of different ways by folks, depending on context. But that, of course, then obliterates the fact that Marx has used exactly the same word and has turned it into a concept by using it again and again and again. I could talk about what that precise word means. It's one of the complicated concepts in Marx, where he says that there is no objectivity in the sense of subject and object, what I think, what's really there, etc. All there is this confused, entangled form of value objectivity, where all that really is objectively true is all that can be expressed in the forms of value that exist under capitalist domination. So if it can't be expressed as value, then it's not true. That's value objectivity, to put it simply. But yeah, that's the problem. It obliterates the real logic because by paraphrasing it, you obscure the fact that he's used the same word again and again in order to give it a conceptual currency.
So in Stupefaction, you write that the difference between a concept and a satire is that satire must always be at someone's expense. So the bourgeoisie seem like they might fit this role. I also get a sense that the bourgeoisie are also trapped in some kind of way. So phrases like vampire-like or werewolf hunger suggest both a kind of violent extraction of the worker's surplus, but also a kind of curse or possession. So how should we think about the figure of the vampire in Marx's Capital?
Before I get to the vampire, just bourgeoisie being trapped. Marx definitely believed that, and he argued it in a very sophisticated, clever way. To be a capitalist was for Marx not fully an ontological kind of category, and by that I mean it wasn't something that was like a category of being. It wasn't like being alive or being dead. However, it was quite close to. It was satirically almost like an ontological category to be the capitalist, to be the capitalist figure. It was also a kind of, he liked to use theatrical metaphors to talk about Mr. Capitalist and Mr. Worker, almost like Punch and Judy. He talked about that a lot in a satirical way. Now, the capitalist is indeed trapped, not in a way that anyone is likely to have pity on him for being trapped, but he is trapped because insofar as he is able to be a capitalist, to stay as a capitalist, to remain a capitalist, he must continually behave as this abstraction, says Marx. He must continually behave as himself part of this mechanism for the circulation of value. And he can't blow all of his money suddenly onto a massive party for all his friends, or something like that, because then all his capital is gone. He can't convert his capital into joy or pleasure completely. Some of it is necessary. Marx calls that the expenses of capital self-representation, where, you've got to have the flashy car or whatever, but you can't blow it all actually on happiness or all on life. You can't, because then what happens is that you tumble out of the category of capitalist and back into the category of worker. So then there's this kind of ontological chute that you fall down from one category into the other. Now, either you are a capitalist, which means that you are this grotesque abstraction, or you take the other way out and say, fuck it, I'm going to chuck it all in the bin and just like have fun. In which case you are mad, because who would choose to give up all of that and cease being a capitalist and become a worker instead? The life of work is to be sucked empty and desertified and crushed and hollowed and everything else. So either you're an abstraction or you're mad, he says to the capitalist. That's your choice. But you can be one or the other. But as for the figure of the vampire, Marx chucks that in now and then, and the figure of the werewolf too. And I think this is where it is more simply figurative, I think. I don't think that's really a very profound part of his poetics. But I think he just means by that these people are inhuman, and there's no point, just like there's no point trying to turn that back into time, there's no point trying to turn a vampire back into a human being. So if there is an implicit argument for the guillotine in Marx, it's that, basically, that these people are just hideous monsters. Get rid of them.
Is there a translation of Capital that you would recommend, or if not recommend, that is more tolerable than the others?
Yeah, it'd be silly of me to say that you can't read the Folks one or any of the others. I mean, these, as I've said, are major works of translation that have been really influential in their own right. So the whole history of the discussion of Marx in English, including all of these wonderful works by Marxists, have been based on Folks's work. So it has its own value now anyhow. So I think that's the one that you really have to read. And it's the only one that is the easiest one to read, because it's the one that's still available in paperback, Penguin, etc. And it's, but then it's hard. This comes back to Verity's important question or challenge. The best way to read it is in a group, probably, form a little group and to read it and to have someone there who's at least able to look up some words in German. If you're able to at least look up some words, which is a really important start. Then you can use online a tool by a guy called Hans Ehrbar, which is Ehrbar. Hans Ehrbar is a Germanist in the United States, a scholar who has put up a searchable parallel translation, his own translation, which is based on Faulk's but with a few tweaks. And you can see the German next to it. So you can scan across and say, of course you can't do that if you know no German at all, but if you know a bit, then you can begin to piece it together. So that's probably the best way to do it. The new one that's going to come out is supposed to come out in 2 years' time from Princeton University Press, but the guy who's doing it is really having a hard time. Like, he's very scared, because what a responsibility! Oh my God, to give to the world the new translation of Capital, and he's a passionate Marxist. So this is now the interpretation of this work for the whole world. That's a heavy burden to have to do that. So he's very anxious, and that's why he's writing to those people, including me, saying like, "Please tell me if you can spot any error in this," and you can immediately. It's like, oh shit, you did. And he's like, but yeah. So that one, when it comes out, yeah. But just read Faulk's. That's of course great, but there are problems with it.
You talked about the poetics of Capital in terms of like Marx's style and the way that Marx writes and how the style is essential to the substance stuff. But obviously, like a poetics can be also a theory of poetry. I was wondering if you think that implicit in Marx is a theory of poetry, because there are plenty of Marxist literary critics, but they tend to kind of abstract some ideas of Marx and then combine it with traditional literary criticism. But whether there is like within the concepts of Marx, whether there is a way of reading.
Yeah, a way of reading poetry and a theory of poetry, I might distinguish. Certainly there's a way of reading poetry. There's not a theory of poetry, I think, there to be extracted from Marx. We could construct one from him, like people have done. But I don't think he had his own theory of poetry. But he had his way of reading poetry, for sure. He wrote about poetry a lot to his friends, about contemporary poets who he thought were just risible or terrible, banal. And my favourite example of this is a German communist poet called Friedrich Freiligrath, who was a very famous poet in Germany and also was in exile in London, like lots of people were. So he'd been serious communist poet, and he came over to England, and he sort of drifted away from communism a bit and became a slightly more mainstreamy liberal lyric poet. And his work was reviewed in the press in England, and this reviewer said, Freiligrath's poetry is getting really good. I like this new stuff. It's just a real pity that early on he was influenced by these nefarious ideas of Karl Marx. That early on his poetry was crap because it was just propaganda. It was too Marxist. But now he's really coming into his own voice, essentially, now that he's escaped the clutches of this. Marx was livid about this, right? Not because he had escaped from Marx or because this reviewer didn't like Marx. Marx loved being hated by reviewers like that. He wrote to Freiligrath and said, "I demand that you publicly state that you are not influenced by me. And the reason for this is not because of anything to do with your Marxism or not. The reason for this is because your poetry is shit. So, I'm not going to be represented by you in literature. Like, who had a way of reading? He was very intolerant. He liked really good poetry, and he didn't care whether it was revolutionary. If it was bad poetry, he detested it. Whereas he loved Heinrich Heine's poetry to the end of his life, even though Heine turned against Marx and the communists and against the whole movement. But he still said, well, Heine is an infinitely greater poet than any of these poor communist hack poets. So he was serious about art. He read intolerantly and seriously.
Here's with the passion thing, because I do notice, of course, the one quite always think with Marx and poetry is the one reported by his daughter, which was when asked about the Romantics, he was like, well, it happened that Byron died when he did, because he would have become a reactionary when he was older. Yeah. Whereas we have to be eternally sad that Shelley died so young, because he had a communist spirit in him and a friend of the workers. And I'm also thinking there of how Marx was a very big fan of Blanquerie, who there's no communist less theoretical and less poetic than Blanquerie. And it's just sort of this, he cares about the drive far more. With the Poetics of Capital. What is it that he thinks links these certain poets and thinkers who were self-described as bourgeois? What connects them to the movement?
Say about this, there's a really good question. With Byron, I think he loved his satirical spirit, how funny Byron was, and how merciless Byron was. Byron crushed other poets underfoot in the way that Marx crushed political economists underfoot. If you want to see an example of this, look at just the first 3 or 4 pages of Byron's poem, Don Juan, right? In Byron's Don Juan, it begins by Bob Southey, you're a poet, poet laureate. That's the opening line, just attacking all the other poets. So Marx loved that spirit of direct, personalised, like fearless, combative confrontation in Byron. But he also loved Byron because Byron was so influential on Heine. So Byron was the poet who was most withering and contemptuous about so-called, the sort of wearying end of Romanticism. Byron despised all of that, so Marx loved him for that reason. But yeah, Blanqui, he nicks lots of Blanqui's ideas. You can find this stuff about to each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. That's the Blanqui, that's not even Marx. So he did nick plenty of that stuff. He took ideas where he found them. Though he hated being plagiarized himself, he didn't mind plagiarizing other people because it was in the service of the revolution.
One last one. I probably think about that. Something you talked a lot about is like Marx's combativeness.
Yeah.
And I feel, bringing it back to your poetry and your writing and your criticism, I guess, and I feel like you've become a lot less combative, specifically of other poets over the years. I feel like
yeah.
I don't know. I feel like there was a sense at a certain point that there was a real sort of combat between kind of a mainstream and which you were maybe playing into a little bit.
Yeah.
And I do seriously think that you've moved away from that quite a long way. Yeah. I'm just interested.
Yeah. Know your enemy, right? I used to be more pissed off about mainstream poetry than I am now. Now I think that it's just meaningless to me. So I used to get exercised about it a lot. I still care a bit. So just to try and sort of reach back into the murky, why did I care so much about it? I do think that the English mainstream poetry has had a terrible influence. As far as it's had any influence on the life of this country, it's been bad. The inheritance that of Philip Larkin as the kind of main figure of this. It's just been dreadful. This sort of dismal little pot plant poems, which are just about the crystallizations of moments of life which need to be described in beautiful little lyric poems with a payoff at the end. You sort of press the button and the feeling falls out. That form of emotional experience I find completely insufferable. Partly that's just me and having my own sort of head or whatever, but also I think it's just a complete falsification of reality. And I think it's contributed to marginalisation is not strong enough. It's contributed to the kind of blanking out, the vanishing of poetry as part of the life of the left and of our culture in general. Because who wants that in their life? Right? It's dismal, boring rubbish. Half look at when you're on the toilet. And it's like poetry, as I think of it, is supposed to be something that absolutely ransacks you to the bottom of your being. It's supposed to be make harder and more vivid and more passionate, more compelling, just like capital does. So here's another, maybe I'm a Procrustean. They're just the same for me in some way. They end up being together. But you're right that I don't have a go at mainstream poets so much anymore. I just can't really be bothered. What is there to say anymore? It used to seem important. Maybe it still is. But now, my poetry attacks other things instead. I think it's still fighting. It's just not fighting those people. But it fights other named people. And the thing I'm like now fights other fights, more squarely aimed at capital and money. Marx started life by attacking other philosophers, right? He was attacking philosophers the whole time. The German ideology, it's one philosopher after another. It's like a coconut shy. It's like, take that, motherfucker. It's like Feuerbach, Edgar Bauer, etc. And then he just realised, and this isn't an epistemological break like Alistair says, but it is a shift in temperament. He just thought, who cares about these people? They're going to disappear anyway. And he was right. They did all still disappear anyway. He said, the real motherfuckers I've got to fight is the person who owns this factory around the corner. He's the one. Yeah, I just feel like that as a poet. So maybe that means that there's less kind of rhetorical fistfights with other people in my poems, but they're aimed differently, I think. But maybe you think that they're still a bit soft. Do you? Yeah, okay, right.
Well, thank you so much, Keston. It's been really wonderful, really enjoyable conversation.
Well,
thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the conversation and for coming along. It's been really fun.